When most people think about the Korean War, they think about frozen infantry at the Chosun Reservoir, mass Chinese assaults, and a conflict that ended where it began. What rarely gets discussed is the quiet revolution in military survival gear that took place in those same frozen hills. Entire units survived, not because of firepower or maneuver, but because a piece of tightly woven cotton canvas refused to leak under weeks of snow, ice, and sub-zero wind. The Korean War was not only a test of ideology and strategy, it was a test of materials, logistics, and preparation in extreme environments. And in that test, one overlooked piece of Cold War canvas quietly reshaped how modern armies think about shelter and survival. If you value this kind of deeper, overlooked military history, consider subscribing early. This channel is about the details that shaped outcomes, not just the battles that filled headlines. The war exposed how unprepared modern armies were for true winter campaigning. By late 1950, United Nations forces advancing north believed the war was nearly won. What followed was a brutal reversal as Chinese forces entered the conflict, and winter descended with a ferocity rarely experienced by American and Allied troops. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Equipment froze, weapons malfunctioned, vehicles stalled, but honestly, one of the most immediate threats was exposure. Many units were operating with inadequate cold-weather shelter systems. Lightweight tarps and improvised coverings failed under sustained snow loads and ice accumulation. Moisture seeped through poorly treated fabrics. Once canvas became saturated and froze, it stiffened, cracked, and lost its insulating properties. In those conditions, shelter was not comfort. It was survival. It was here that the US military's heavier, tightly woven, paraffin-treated canvas tent systems proved their value. These were not modern synthetic shelters. They were thick, dense cotton duck canvas, chemically treated for water resistance and durability. They were heavy, they were not convenient, but, they worked. The canvas that never leaked was the product of hard lessons from earlier wars. The Korean War did not begin in a vacuum. The US Army had inherited equipment doctrine from World War II, where large-scale encampments required durable, weather-resistant structures. The M1942 and later tent systems were designed for prolonged field deployment. They used thick canvas, treated with water-repellent compounds, and reinforced seams designed to handle tension and weight. In Korea, these features were no longer conveniences, they were lifelines. Snow accumulation on tent roofs could exceed several inches overnight. Inferior materials sagged and collapsed. The heavier canvas systems held their shape under proper staking and internal support poles. When heated by small field stoves, the fabric allowed minimal moisture penetration while venting enough to reduce internal condensation. It was an imperfect solution, but compared to lightweight alternatives, it was transformative. Soldiers later recalled that properly pitched and maintained canvas tents could endure weeks of punishing weather without significant leakage. That reliability stabilized morale in ways that rarely appear in official reports. Reliable shelter quietly preserved combat effectiveness. When discussing warfare, analysts focus on tactics and firepower, but in Korea, the ability to maintain dry clothing, prevent frostbite, and allow soldiers even a few hours of protected rest determined unit readiness. Wet troops become cold troops. Cold troops lose dexterity. Loss of dexterity affects weapon handling, maintenance, and reaction times. The chain of consequence is straightforward. The heavy canvas tent became a micro-environment of relative stability. Inside, socks could dry, weapons could be cleaned, maps could be studied without wind tearing at them. Officers could plan operations with some degree of continuity. This was not luxury, it was a logistical anchor in a volatile environment. The lesson was not about comfort, it was about sustainability under extreme conditions. Cold weather failures forced doctrine changes after the war. The Korean War exposed glaring weaknesses in cold weather doctrine. Equipment originally designed for European climates struggled in Korean mountain winters. The experience forced a reassessment of materials science and field survival planning. Post-war military research invested heavily in synthetic fabrics that could replicate or exceed the water resistance of treated canvas while reducing weight. But the principle remained unchanged. Durability and environmental resilience could not be sacrificed for convenience. The canvas tents of Korea demonstrated that robustness mattered more than portability in certain theaters. This influenced later developments in Arctic warfare preparation during the broader Cold War. NATO forces training in Norway and Alaska adopted shelter systems designed with similar priorities: water resistance, structural integrity, and repairability in the field. The overlooked reality is that gear decisions ripple outward into doctrine. Survival in Korea was often a logistical equation rather than a tactical one. Chinese forces, many operating with minimal heavy equipment, relied on mobility and concealment. United Nations forces relied on supply chains. That supply chain included shelter materials that had to survive repeated redeployment. Canvas tents were repairable, tiers could be patched, seams could be resealed. In a war defined by shifting lines and difficult terrain, this mattered. Lightweight materials that failed required replacement. Heavy canvas endured. For survival-minded observers today, this offers a clear lesson. The most advanced solution is not always the most resilient. Field repairability, material thickness, and long-term durability often determine whether equipment supports sustained operations. The human dimension of winter warfare is rarely highlighted. Much of the Korean War narrative centers on strategic stalemate and political outcomes. Less attention is given to the psychological toll of constant exposure to extreme weather. Reliable shelter provided not just physical protection but psychological stability. In prolonged conflict, predictability is scarce. Knowing that your shelter will hold against wind and snow reduces stress in measurable ways. Cold injuries during the Korean War numbered in the tens of thousands. Frostbite and trench foot cases surged during the early winter campaigns. Improvements in shelter, clothing, and field heating later in the war reduced these numbers. The role of durable canvas structures in that reduction is rarely acknowledged. The lesson is not sentimental. It is practical. Environment shapes warfare as much as enemy action. Material culture shapes military memory. Why is this rarely discussed? Because tents do not carry the drama of battlefield maneuvers. They leave no monuments. Yet, they shaped daily existence. The heavy canvas tent became a symbol of continuity for many veterans. It was the place where letters were written, rations prepared, and plans revised. It represented a fragile but crucial boundary between chaos and order. In Cold War planning that followed, military procurement increasingly emphasized multi-environment durability. Arctic gear, desert shelters, and modular systems all trace conceptual lineage back to hard-learned lessons in Korea. Preparedness is often invisible when it works. The reason this Cold War canvas never leaked in memory is not because it was flawless. It was because, under extreme conditions, it performed when failure would have had cascading consequences. Modern survival culture often emphasizes lightweight, high-tech solutions. There is value in innovation, but Korea reminds us that rugged simplicity, properly maintained, can outperform convenience in extreme environments. The Korean War sits at the intersection of industrial-era logistics and modern mechanized conflict. It revealed that wars are sustained not just by strategy, but by fabric, stitching, treatment chemicals, and supply discipline. Those details rarely appear in sweeping war narratives, but they matter. Remembering the overlooked details helps us understand the whole. When we look back at 20th century conflicts, it is easy to focus on political outcomes and battlefield turning points. Yet wars are lived in tents, trenches, and temporary shelters as much as in command centers. The Cold War canvas that endured Korean winters represents something larger than equipment. It represents adaptation under pressure and the quiet evolution of survival doctrine. Understanding those lessons deepens our understanding of the conflict itself. It reminds us that resilience is often built into the smallest details long before the first shot is fired. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, where materials, logistics, and overlooked realities are treated with the seriousness they deserve, subscribe to the channel and share this video with someone who appreciates history beyond the headlines. The details may seem small, but they are often where the real lessons of war reside.